On the evening of February 24th, 1978, five friends from Northern California set off to watch a basketball game. They never returned. Months later, four of them were discovered dead in the remote wilderness of the Plumas National Forest, 70 miles from their intended destination. The fifth man has never been found, alive or dead. The disappearance of the men from Yuba County is a case we have explored before. However, in the years since, Bedtime Stories has become aware of previously unavailable information that sheds an entirely different light on this infamous story. Thanks to the work of one diligent investigative writer who graciously agreed to collaborate on this, we may finally be ready to revisit the tragedy of the Yuba County Five. Before we begin, we must acknowledge the work of author Tony Wright in early 2024. After years of research and first-hand interviews, Tony published Things Aren't Right: The Disappearance of the Yuba County Five. His book provides the foundation for this continuation, and Tony himself has very kindly wrote this episode. If you wish to explore the case in greater detail, you can find a link to Tony's book in the description. In investigating this case, Tony examined police files, testimony, and family memories to produce the most comprehensive account to date. His work has not only uncovered new insights, but has also challenged many long-standing misconceptions about the men at the heart of this story. For too long, the disappearance of the Yuba County Five has been framed around their supposed disabilities, with the men often dismissed as helpless or childlike. This characterization is misleading. Each of them had strengths, routines, and personalities that their families knew well. They were socially awkward at times, but they were not the dimwits some commentators have since cruelly labeled them as. They were capable adults with fulfilling lives, whose routines and bonds of friendship mattered deeply to them. Understanding this is crucial. It reshapes how we view not only the men themselves, but also the assumptions that have shaded this case for decades. To appreciate why the narrative of vulnerability and incapacity has lingered so strongly, we must return to the events of February 24, 1978, and to the men at the center of this enduring mystery. In the unlikely event that you have not heard this story before, we will provide a brief recap of what happened. However, we strongly recommend going back and listening to our original episode on the case for a fuller account. The five men at the heart of this case were Ted Weir, age 32, Jack Hewitt, 24, Bill Sterling, 29, Jack Madruga, 30, and Gary Mathias, 25. All were connected through a nonprofit program called Gateway Projects, which provided employment, coaching, and support for those living with developmental or psychiatric challenges. Many pointed to their involvement with Gateway as proof that these men were slow or, to use the terminology of the time, mentally retarded. This portrayal was deeply unfair. In modern terms, most of the group would likely have been recognized as being on the autism spectrum, with traits consistent with what we now call Asperger's. They were not unintelligent nor incapable. The only one with a diagnosed psychiatric illness was Gary Mathias, who had schizophrenia. Yet even in his case, family members said he had been stable for 2 years, thanks to treatment and medication. The five shared a strong bond through basketball. They played for Gateway's team, the Gators, and were due to compete in a big tournament on the morning of February 25, 1978. The night before, on the 24th, they drove Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego, north from Yuba City to Chico, to watch UC Davis take on Chico State. The journey was about 50 miles, and they cheered enthusiastically as UC Davis secured the win. What happened on the drive home remains the central mystery. Instead of following the main route south, the men somehow ended up far off course. At some point near Oroville, the Montego left the highway and climbed several thousand feet into the Plumas National Forest. It was winter, the road snowbound, and none of the men were dressed for such conditions. When Madruga's car became stuck in drifts of snow on a remote forestry track, the group was stranded. What followed is pieced together only from fragments. One man, Joseph Shones, later reported that on the same night he, too, had become stuck in the snow just a short distance up the road. He claimed to have seen or heard people outside during the night, though his recollections changed with retelling. Beyond that, we can only infer. What is known is stark. The Montego was located not long after the search began, abandoned on a remote mountain road with a quarter tank of fuel, food, and maps still inside. But of the men themselves, there was no sign. It wasn't until June, many months later, that motorcyclists stumbled across a Forest Service trailer, 15 miles from the car. Inside was Ted Weir. He had succumbed to the cold and starvation after weeks of survival, losing nearly
80 pounds in body weight. Tragically, survival rations and heat sources, which might otherwise have saved his life, had been left unused in the trailer. Over the following days, the skeletal remains of Sterling, Madruga, and Hewitt were located in the woods nearby. Only Gary Mathias was never recovered. His shoes were found in the trailer, but no trace of his body has ever been located. Decades later, the questions are as haunting as ever. Why had the men driven into the mountains in the first place? Why abandon the car when the road would have been the surest path back to safety? Why did Weir fail to make use of the supplies that could have kept him alive? And above all, what became of Gary Mathias? The facts in this case ceased to add up the moment their car turned onto that mountain road. From that decision onwards, every answer only seems to open the door to more unsettling questions. When we strip this case down to its bare bones, one name comes up again and again: Joseph Shonis, as the person who claims to have last seen the men alive, and the only one confirmed to have been on that mountain at the same time. Almost every timeline, theory, and official record hinges on his testimony. But before Tony Wright, few people seemed to show much interest in who Joseph Shonis was, and more importantly, how he might play into the mystery. Shonis was 55 years old in 1978. He was a local of Berry Creek, a small community located around the Oroville-Quincy Highway, and few people who lived there had many good things to say about him. Most described him as abrasive, even something of a bully. He was a heavy drinker and had a reputation for being quarrelsome in public. This is significant for several reasons, but mainly because when the Yuba County Five went missing, residents of the Berry Creek area were shocked to find that the authorities were trusting Shonis, of all people. But the truth is that they had no other choice, and neither do we. So let's take a look at the events of February 24th from his point of view. That afternoon, Shonis had stopped at the Mountain House Lodge, a weathered bar and rest stop perched on the edge of the Plumas. Staff recalled him drinking beers around 5, after which he left and began to drive up towards the snow line. At least one employee found this odd, as he was not only traveling away from Berry Creek, but that northern pass was notorious for trapping cars for hours. According to Shonis, whilst driving up the snowy incline, his Volkswagen Beetle veered off the track into deep snow. As he struggled to push the car free, he claimed to have suffered a heart attack. Weak and gasping, he crawled back into his car, turned the engine over for warmth, and waited. Hours slipped by. Then around midnight, he saw headlights and watched another car come to a stop about 100 yards behind him. It was a Mercury Montego, the same model later confirmed as Jack Madruga's car. What's happened next? Well, that depends on which of Shonis' many versions you believe. In his first retellings, he described seeing 5 figures climb out of the car, pause, and then retreat into the forest without a word. In later accounts, Shonis claims he saw a red pickup truck trailing the men, driven by a man with a woman and a baby inside. Sometimes he claimed to see the 5 jump into the bed of that truck. Other times they simply melted into the darkness. Whatever the case, he says he tried calling out for help only to be ignored entirely. By dawn the next morning, Shonis had run out of fuel and was on the verge of freezing, so he began the 8-mile walk back down the highway towards Mountain House. He would later say that he took a moment to investigate the Montego, upon passing it hoping that he might use it as a place to rest. But upon looking at the objects in the back, which included either baby toys or clothes, he decided to just keep walking. Either way, for a man who had just suffered a heart attack, walking this distance should have been impossible. But after hours of what he described as torturous progress, he arrived at Mountain House. Employees say he entered the lodge, ordered water and aspirin, and began talking. However, he said nothing about being stranded in the mountains, nothing about his Beetle getting stuck in the snow, nothing about having a heart attack, and nothing about seeing 5 strangers in the night. At least one witness claimed he repeated the phrase, "I should have done this 2 years ago," several times, which he found odd. For a man who should have been in urgent need of medical attention, his behavior makes little sense. After a few minutes, a couple at the bar offered him a lift home to Berry Creek. Along the way, they say, he complained constantly about the man's driving, which would again seem unusual for someone who had nearly died on a frozen highway just a few hours earlier. Back home, Shonis told his wife Cindy about his ordeal. Though we can't verify what he said, we know that instead of rushing him to the hospital, Cindy focused on recovering his Beetle. With a local man's help, she
returned to the mountains, where they found Joseph's car, as he had claimed the battery was dead and the fuel tank was empty. But more importantly, they saw another vehicle abandoned nearby, the Mercury Montego. It wasn't until the following day that Joseph was taken to the hospital. But here, we once again run into verification problems, namely the fact that the medical records of his stay seem to have disappeared. Cindy would also claim that he was inconsolable and unable to talk about what had happened the night before without breaking down once more. This seems to run contrary to his behavior in the bar the previous morning, where he appeared completely unshaken. It was only in the ensuing weeks that Shonis inserted himself into the narrative surrounding the missing men. He gave interviews to law enforcement, newspapers, and even the worried families. However, it seemed that this story changed depending on the day and with whom he was talking. Sometimes he mentioned drinking only a beer or 2, other times 6 or more. Sometimes there was a truck with a man, woman, and baby, and sometimes there wasn't. To police, he hinted that the men may have been abducted. To journalists, he suggested that they had simply ignored him. And yet he remained the only witness who could place them on that road.
The contradictions led many to doubt him. Some thought he might be angling for the $10,000 reward. Adjusted for inflation, the families had offered for information. Others wrote him off as lonely, embellishing or even fabricating stories to gain attention. But there is also the possibility that he was hiding something darker. He had a reputation for throwing his weight around, drinking too much, and acting unpredictably. Some wondered if he had perhaps crossed paths with the five men and played, at least, some role in their decision to leave their car that evening, because even to this day, the idea that the men would abandon the shelter of the car leaves people baffled. According to the vehicle's specifications, it could have idled for anywhere from 5 to 8 hours on a quarter tank of fuel, long enough to keep them warm through the night. The only way the men, 2 of whom had military training, would leave that relative security would be if it was not safe on that road for some reason. This has led many to focus on the sometimes there, sometimes not factor in Sean's story, the red truck. If this part of his tale is genuine, then there were others present that night. As to what role, if any, they played in the men's disappearance, it is all lost in the ever-shifting recollections of Joseph Sean's. For nearly half a century, the case of the Yuba County Five has generated theories, some tame, some bizarre. The problem is that few, if any, can satisfy the 4 key mysteries at the heart of the story. Why did they turn up that road instead of going home? Why did they leave the car after getting stuck? Why did one or more of them live for several weeks, or possibly even months, in a trailer filled with food and provisions, and never once attempted to seek help? Lastly, what became of Gary Mathias? Many agree that it's possible the men were chased up the mountain road. If they were hiding from someone, it would explain why they abandoned the car and why they chose to stay in the trailer. But who was chasing them and why? Previously mentioned theories about potential altercations after the basketball game can somewhat be dismissed. They would almost certainly not have stopped at the convenience store for snacks if someone was pursuing them, and they would have likely not driven the 23 miles to Oroville before deciding to make a run for the mountains. If they needed help, the city would have been the best place to find it. But what if the altercation took place in Oroville? Mathias had friends there, so it might have been a potential stop. And since the men were adults in good spirits, it's not impossible to imagine them stopping somewhere else along their route. This matters because back then, the town was considered quite rough around the edges, with a reputation for drunken fights and unsavory company. With their perceived disabilities and awkward social skills, the men would unfortunately have been prime targets for locals looking to cause trouble. Some have suggested that Mathias and his friends could have been harassed, mocked, and chased away. In that scenario, driving into the plumes may have been a desperate attempt to shake pursuers. This might also explain why there was an open California road map found in the back seat. Had the men been looking for a way off the road before getting stuck? If they had been chased, this would also explain why they would have abandoned their car, as it would have instantly been spotted by their pursuers. For those who think it's unlikely that the men would have been targeted so randomly, there is another version of this theory. It focuses on Gary Mathias, the only person who was never found. Some Oroville residents claim that Gary had clashed with some locals in recent
months, even getting into a fight with an unknown man at a party. There are also stories indicating he had a confrontation with a man named Farron Delosier, who just so happened to be married to Jack Hewitt's sister. Could someone with a grudge against Mathias have spotted him and forced the group up the mountain road? Many argue that it seems more plausible than a complete stranger doing the same. In our first episode, we mentioned how in 2017, a person claiming to be Hugh's sister-in-law came forward to state that Mathias had been attacked and thrown off a bridge, causing his friends to panic and flee for their lives. This could theoretically explain why Mathias was never found, and there is indeed a large bridge, the Bidwell Bar Bridge, at the entrance to the highway. This could be further supported by the fact that some claimed shell casings were found at the entrance to the mountain pass. If someone had shot at the men, they would have been well justified in driving further into danger. It sounds like a long shot, but the fact that a couple of Jackie's extended family members seem to be involved raises a lot of questions. Others point to a similar occurrence, only this time the suspect is a town bully, mentioned by Gary's family in the 1990s. Rumors even circulated that this man had confessed, during a church service, to leading a group of disabled men to their deaths. No direct witness ever came forward to substantiate the story, but it fed into the idea that someone in the community knew more than they were letting on. It's possible that this has to do with yet another frequently overlooked facet of the story, the fact that Gateway Projects, the local program that supported people with disabilities, had been the subject of targeted harassment for years. Between 1975 and 1976, a local who was never identified set off a spate of arson attacks on Gateway facilities, even setting several cars alight. The most shocking incident came on April 6, 1975, when Gateway's director, Donald Garrett, answered a knock at his apartment door and was doused in fluid before being set ablaze. He died almost instantly. The crime was never solved, though rumors swirled about jealous lovers, grudges, and feuds. It's been theorized that one or more members of the Yuba County Five may have known something about the arsonist identity. If true, then their disappearance could have been an attempt to silence them permanently.
Some researchers have discovered a possible suspect for the arsons and murder of Donald Garrett, but no name has yet been disclosed. Of course, this wouldn't be bedtime stories if we didn't consider at least one possibility involving the paranormal. And when we revisit the details of this case, there is one particular police report that stands out as curious. It records a witness, Janet Kathleen Nzara, who told investigators that Gary Mathias had confided in her more than once about a recurring dream. In it, he claimed that he and several others would one day vanish, taken away alongside strange lights and people from outer space. At the time, her statement was dismissed as irrelevant. They simply depicted the ramblings of a man known to suffer from psychiatric illness. But placed alongside what happened to the men, it becomes harder to ignore. What if Gary's nightmare was not delusion but premonition? What if his illness allowed him to somehow tap into a higher plane of consciousness? And what if on the night of February 24th, 1978, something far stranger really did occur? On that lonely mountain road, there have been many accounts, both in America and elsewhere, of vehicles pursued by unidentified flying objects. Drivers report being followed for miles by glowing lights in the sky, sometimes experiencing engine trouble, strange interference, or overwhelming dread. The Oroville-Quincy Highway, which the men traveled that night, would have been almost deserted at that hour. Outside of the town limits, there were no streetlights, no traffic, and no houses for long stretches, only blackness on either side of the road. In such an isolated setting, an encounter with something unusual could have been terrifying. If a light or object descended upon the car, it might explain why the men suddenly left the main highway and drove up into the Sierra foothills. Turning onto a remote Forest Service road, rarely used by the public, may have been a desperate attempt to escape whatever was following them. The men might have witnessed something extraordinary, something so disturbing that it sent them scattering into the forest. If Gary Mathias had indeed been taken in full view of his friends, the panic that followed could explain why they fled blindly into the freezing wilderness. Their decision to leave the road and the car might not have been a rational choice at all, but a reaction to sheer terror. It is, of course, a far-fetched idea, and most would say an unlikely one. The more plausible explanation is that some very human element, whether foul play, misdirection, or tragic confusion, forced the men off the highway.
That night,